Activity that I think you'll find especially effective when you're teaching your students expository or informational text. It's called SQP2RS, which is impossible to remember, and so a group of kids, third graders, decided to name it Squeepers. What it is an instructional framework for teaching your students how to think like readers in informational and expository text. So let's look at the steps of Squeepers. The very first step is that your students will preview text, and I usually suggest no more than about a minute for a preview. Have them really focus for 1 minute on a survey or a preview. Be sure and do a think aloud and a model when you introduce previewing or surveying, because it's real important for students to know what to look for. Next, we're going to have students question, where they're going to, based upon their preview, list a few questions that they think that they'll find answers to by reading this text. The students will be working in groups to come up with their questions, and when I feel that they've had enough time to generate 2 or 3 questions about what they think they're going to learn when they read this text, I'm going to ask them, and we're going to post the questions on our chart. So I'll go to Group 1 and say, Group 1, what's one question you think we'll find answers to when we read this text? So let's pretend that Group 1 comes up with the question, where in the universe is the Earth found? Now when I have Group 1 give that question, as always happens in classes, a few other groups may have come up with a very similar question. So I'm going to say to the class, does anybody else have that question? And Group 2 says, yeah, we had that question, and I'm going to put a star on the chart. Group 3 says, we did too. Group 4, Group 5, then I'm going to put a star or an asterisk or a check mark to indicate that other groups also had that same question. Once you have the questions, then we want to narrow the focus even more. That's what students have such a difficult time with expository text. They think everything's important. They have a hard time figuring out what's truly important. That's why Squeepers is such a good technique to use with them. So based upon the questions and based upon those that have lots of asterisks or stars, we then will come up with only maybe 3 or 4 predictions of the most important information we're going to learn by reading this chapter. Now be careful here. Please resist the temptation to overly control this process of the students coming up with questions or figuring out what they think is most important. The reason I caution for that is that let the students figure this out. If they find that maybe they didn't ask the right questions or maybe they learned some other important information, that can be adjusted later in the Squeepers process during the response time. Once we've completed this process, then we'll move on to the reading. Now at this point, you may think, oh wow, that took a long time. Well, it probably took me longer to explain it than it actually takes to do it in the classroom. Try to aim for 5 to 7 minutes of instructional time. For the survey, that only takes a minute, for the generation of questions, and for the predictions. They then read the text either with a partner, individually, small group, or with the teacher. You may have the students either choose the way that they're going to read, or of course you could assign it. The main thing you want students to do is finish reading at about the same time so you can pick up on the next step of the process. The next step is to have the students respond. They can respond to the questions that were generated earlier. They can modify the questions based upon what they've read so far. They may drop some questions because they're no longer relevant. Finally, we want our students to be able to all summarize what was read, either orally or in writing. They can summarize as partners, they can summarize in a group, it can be written on a chart, or you may want students to do an oral summary by themselves to be able to ensure that you have individual accountability at this point. So in a nutshell, that's Squeepers. Now in my research on Squeepers, with 4th graders and with 10th graders, I found several things. First of all, I found that student engagement was great, much more engagement. Lots of students don't get real excited about reading their textbooks, but when they're working with their partners, where they're in the control of doing the reading, coming up with the questions, coming up with the predictions, they're much more engaged and more likely to learn the information.